Hey guys, my name is Alex, and this is the 17th installment in my video project series thing, Kingly Endeavors, in which I intend to read all of Stephen King's novels in chronological order and to hopefully post a video a week about them. This week, belatedly, I read The Dark Half, and unfortunately I didn't like it that much at all. I didn't like it at all. Yeah, in part it's because the book is really predictable, and in part it's because the prose is very weak, and in part it's because the characters are the flattest characters he's ever created, but mostly it's just because huge swaths of it are just unbearably boring. And as I think most people would agree, being boring is probably the worst crime a writer can commit. I know someone in the comments is going to be like, well, what about when they throw vodka at the elderly? There are worse crimes that a writer can commit, but in the craft itself, the worst thing you can be is boring. The premise of The Dark Half is that there's a writer named Thaddeus Beaumont, and Thaddeus Beaumont is a literary novelist with a capital L. His great highbrow literary novels don't really hit a home run financially, so in order to pay the bills, Thaddeus Beaumont creates a pseudonym, George Stark. Under the name of George Stark, he starts to publish these really violent, gritty thrillers, potboilers, essentially. After a couple years of great success with George Stark's novels, unfortunately somebody finds out that Thaddeus Beaumont is George Stark. So Thaddeus, who's been wanting to give up the George Stark mantle for quite some time, decides he's going to beat this kid to the punch. He's going to come out to the press himself and say, I am George Stark. And he goes through with it. He gives up the title, he stops writing the George Stark novels, and it seems like he's slated to live happily ever after as Thaddeus Beaumont, the failing literary writer. Then, inexplicably, the people associated with the publication of the George Stark novels start to die. The idea, of course, is that George Stark, this figment of Thad Beaumont's imagination, his literary alter ego, has come to life and is now paving a way in blood, or whatever movie quote you want to use. He's going to get back to Thad, and he's going to force Thad to write a new George Stark novel. Really, the only way I found it, kind of intriguing for the duration of the novel is in sort of, I guess you'd call it a metafictional or biographical overlay, because what we need to keep in mind is that this is a novel about a novelist who is surrendering his novelistic alter ego, and it is being written by a novelist who has just surrendered his literary alter ego. The Dark Half was published at the end of the 1980s, which was also the point at which Stephen King had to surrender his own literary pseudonym, which was Richard Bachman. What was interesting about the use of Stephen King's alter ego, Richard Bachman, is that he used that name to publish the novels that he had written prior to Carrie, for which he could not find a publisher. So the way that I found it interesting in terms, if you want to take a biographical perspective, is that here we have, in Thad Beaumont, a writer who is confronting and fighting with his pseudonym, George Stark. So if we're going to be kind of crude about it and just sort of paste Stephen King's life over this story, we could say, okay, here is Stephen King clashing with and fighting Richard Bachman. That scenario, of course, begs the question, what does Richard Bachman mean to Stephen King? Well, what came to mind is that because Stephen King was mostly using the Richard Bachman name to publish the novels that he had written in his 20s, when Stephen King confronts and really assesses the works of Richard Bachman, he's essentially confronting the work of his own younger self. Also, Stephen King was in his 40s when this book came out, and so here you've got a guy in his 40s looking at the work that he wrote when he was in his 20s. It's like these two neat, calendric halves of his life that are suddenly coming together. I don't know, it's kind of a messy metaphor. Maybe it works for you, maybe it doesn't. As with Pet Sematary, I just found this novel so fucking inflated. The first 30 pages of this novel are a nightmare of exposition. We get this prologue in which we see Thad Beaumont as a kid. He's having seizures, he's having these terrible headaches, and so they think that he's got a brain tumor. Surgeons go into his head, and when they go into his head, they find vestiges of some twin fetus that was absorbed, I guess, into Thad's body in utero. The suggestion is meant to be, then, that George Stark, his pseudonym, his alter ego, is actually his digested twin's spirit that has come up from the grave. But the way in which this kind of fucks with the pacing of the book is that we know from the prologue going forward that there is a supernatural explanation to all the horror that takes place in this novel. Yet we get a solid 70 pages of dialogue between Thad and this cop, Alan Pangborn, trying to figure out some real-world explanation. Meanwhile, we as the readers already know the explanation, so why am I reading all these pages of these two dudes trying and failing to find the explanation that I already know? I've also got these long, dawdling dream sequences where Thad walks very slowly through houses wherein vases are splitting in half, and it's like this very heavy-handed metaphors and use of symbolism. But the problem with dream sequences is that when we know from the outset of a dream sequence that we are in a dream sequence, what we also know is that the action taking place within this dream has no consequence. The action in The Dark Half is outstanding, it's very gory, it's very gripping, it's very propulsive. There are also instances in which it is just agonizingly, superficial or predictable. There is literally a scene where the villain with his switchblade approaches two cops who have been named Cop Number 1 and Cop Number 2. As though any reader would not immediately assume that cops with names 1 and 2 are about to be just senselessly slaughtered. They're just total fodder for the killer's blade. But whatever, it is what it is. It's one of the slider Stephen King novels. It's really not that long. Yes, I do categorize it with Firestarter and Pet Sematary as like the very worst of his books up to this point in his career. But whatever, it is what it is. I'll move on to the next one, which I've already filmed a review for it, and I loved it. So, constant reader, thanks for watching.